My name is Claire Morgan, I'm 28, and if I'm honest with you, all I ever wanted was something so simple it almost feels embarrassing to say out loud. I just wanted my parents to be proud of me, not for winning awards or making money or living up to anybody else's standard, but just proud of me as their daughter. I used to daydream that on my wedding day, my mom would squeeze my hand before I walked down the aisle, my dad would beam at me from the front row, and for once in my life, I'd feel like I wasn't standing in my sister's shadow, but instead of warmth and tears of joy, what I got was silence, cold, sharp, deliberate silence. They told me my wedding didn't matter, called it a small event for someone at the bottom, and while I stood in a white dress, trembling with hope, they were already on a plane to Hawaii, laughing on a beach with my sister, celebrating her engagement like mine was nothing but a line item they'd rather erase. I can still remember the feeling in my stomach when I opened my phone that night. My hands were sticky from nerves, my mascara smudged, and instead of a message from my mom saying she was sorry for missing it, there was a video. A cocktail glass clinking, palm trees swaying, my parents' voices ringing with joy as they toasted my sister Sydney and her fiancé. My heart didn't just ache, it cracked wide open. I'd built up this fragile belief that maybe, just maybe, they'd surprise me, that even if they couldn't be there in person, they'd send a note, a flower, something. Instead, I got proof, broadcast for everyone to see, that my big day was less important to them than another round of tropical drinks. And the strangest thing is, while guests laughed around me, I felt a loneliness I can't quite put into words, like being erased from my own family photo. And as if that wasn't enough, a few days later the phone rang, and it was my dad. His voice didn't carry a hint of apology, not even the courtesy of regret. Instead, he had a demand, another request, another way to remind me that no matter what I did, I was there to serve their needs. I remember sitting at our tiny kitchen table, staring at the knot in the wood grain as he spoke, my new husband Andrew pacing behind me, trying not to explode. My dad talked about money as if nothing had happened, as if skipping my wedding was just a minor scheduling conflict. And all I could think was, how do you demand more from someone you've already wounded so deeply? That was the moment a switch flipped inside me. For years I'd been invisible, quietly painting my life in the margins while they hung Sydney's triumphs on the walls for everyone to admire. But something about that phone call, stacked on top of the empty chairs at my wedding and that cursed video of their celebration, made me realize I couldn't keep chasing scraps of affection that were never coming. If I didn't draw a line right there, if I didn't finally say, enough, then I'd spend the rest of my life begging for a love that was never mine to begin with. And maybe you know that feeling too, the sting of longing for your family's support only to meet cold rejection. If you do, then you understand the weight of that silence and why I finally chose to stop carrying it. Sydney was everything my parents ever wanted wrapped into one perfect package. She had that polished smile that made neighbors lean in a little closer, she knew how to charm teachers, and by the time she hit high school, my mom and dad were already telling anyone who'd listen that their daughter was destined for law school. I'd watch from the hallway, while my mom stood in her pressed blouse, bragging about Sydney's debate trophies, her scholarships, her internships, while my own sketchbook sat in my lap, the graphite smudging onto my fingertips like a secret I wasn't supposed to share. I was the quiet one, the girl who filled notebooks with city skylines and fashion sketches, not court cases or speeches, and in their eyes that meant I was dreaming too small. I still remember the first time I dared to show my dad something I'd drawn, a bright watercolor cityscape I'd stayed up half the night finishing, the paper still a little warped from the water. He barely looked at it, muttered, "That's nice, Claire," and turned right back to asking Sydney about her debate team. It felt like being erased in real time. That moment became the rhythm of my childhood, her triumphs displayed front and center, mine swept quietly under the rug. My parents built a gallery of Sydney's life right on our living room wall, gold medals and glossy photos lined up in perfect rows, while my achievements, even when I worked myself raw for them, were shuffled into drawers. When I was 10, I won a county-wide art contest. I'd poured weeks into that painting, mixing colors on our back porch, the smell of acrylic staining my clothes. I brought home the certificate trembling with excitement, praying maybe this time I'd get the proud hug I'd been chasing. My mom glanced at it, nodded, said a flat, "Good job," then went right back to hanging Sydney's new medals. The same week, they threw a backyard party, invited half the neighborhood, balloons, catering, even a DJ. Not for my award, but for Sydney's college acceptance letter. I stood by the lemonade table watching my mom glow with pride, and I felt invisible, as though I'd wandered into someone else's celebration. The older we got, the starker the gap became. Sydney got a brand new laptop so she could practice for competitions, while I was handed down her half-used sketchpad with the cover already bent. They'd drive across the state just to cheer her on, voices hoarse from shouting. And when my first art show opened at the high school gym, I stood alone under those buzzing fluorescent lights. My drawings were pinned crookedly to a corkboard, the smell of old varnish clinging to the bleachers, while other kids' parents took photos, beamed with pride, and handed their children flowers. I tried to smile, but deep inside I felt like a ghost haunting my own dreams. I'll never forget the night I overheard my mom chatting with our neighbor, Mrs. Kennedy, over the back fence, her voice carrying clear as a bell through the humid Atlanta air. She was bragging about Sydney the way some people brag about winning the lottery, saying, "That girl is going places, just wait until she's a lawyer." I was sitting on the porch steps, clutching my sketchpad to my chest, feeling the words cut through me sharper than a blade. It wasn't anger I felt, at least not at first. It was more like a dull ache in my stomach, the kind that makes you want to curl up and disappear. By the time high school rolled around, that ache was just part of my life. Sydney had gone off to college, collecting one award after another in pre-law, while my parents put her on speakerphone during dinner so they could gush about her internships. I'd opened my mouth to share something small, like the day I got accepted into an art program at a local gallery, and before I could finish, my dad would cut me off with, "But did you hear about Sydney's offer from that law firm?" And just like that, my little flame of excitement would fizzle out. The only adult who ever seemed to really see me back then was my art teacher, Mrs. Greer. She had a messy bun that never stayed up, paint stains on her hands, and she'd lean over my shoulder whispering, "Don't stop, Claire. You've got something here." She believed in me with a certainty my parents never even pretended to show. She'd slip brochures for design schools into my sketchbooks and circle deadlines in red pen, like she was throwing me a lifeline. Without her, I think I might have let my sketchpads gather dust and convinced myself I wasn't good enough. When Sydney came home on breaks, the whole house turned into a stage set for her return. My parents scrubbed every inch until it gleamed, stocked the fridge with her favorite foods, and rearranged their schedules so they could hang on her every word. Meanwhile, I was handed a dish rag and told to tidy up. I remember standing at the kitchen sink, the smell of lemon cleaner stinging my nose, while my mom laughed at every story Sydney told, like even her pauses were worth applauding. Once, I crept halfway down the stairs, holding one of my designs, hoping to show it off, only to hear my mom whisper to Sydney, "You're the one we're proud of. You're the future of this family." I sat there, in the half-dark, with my drawing pressed to my chest, realizing in a way I'd never admitted before that I wasn't even part of the picture they were painting. By the time senior year came around, I stopped chasing what I knew I'd never catch. I stopped trying to earn their praise and started pouring everything I had into my portfolio. Nights smelled like pencil shavings and coffee, my fingers cramped from hours of sketching, my eyes burning from staring at color palettes. Mrs. Greer guided me every step of the way, and when the acceptance letter for a full scholarship in graphic design finally arrived, I held it like a fragile piece of glass, knowing it wasn't just a piece of paper. It was my ticket out, my chance to build a life that wasn't measured against Sydney's shadow. When that scholarship letter came, I felt like the universe had finally cracked open a small door just wide enough for me to squeeze through. But when I rushed to tell my parents, heart pounding, they just smiled politely and said, "That's nice, Claire, but be practical." It stung more than I can explain, because days later I overheard them talking about a loan they'd taken for Sydney's law school, calling it an investment in the family. That word, investment, stuck in my chest like a splinter. My dreams were never seen as worth betting on. At 18, though, I had my first real break. A small gallery in downtown Atlanta reached out, offering me a spot in a student showcase. I thought my heart would burst. I designed the invitations myself, typed up the details, and mailed them to everyone I loved. I imagined my mom standing in front of one of my canvases, her eyes softening, my dad shaking hands with strangers, proud to be introduced as my parents. Instead, the night of the opening, I stood in that gallery, under harsh track lights, surrounded by strangers who admired my work, their perfume and cologne mingling with the smell of paint and wine, and the only sound louder than the chatter was the silence of my parents' absence. Across town, they were hosting yet another party, balloons and champagne in hand, celebrating Sydney's acceptance to law school. I smiled and thanked people who complimented my art, but inside, I was hollow. I watched other kids beam as their parents snapped photos, flowers in hand, arms wrapped tight around them, and I had no one. My work was good, I knew it, I felt it in the way people lingered, but the pride I wanted most wasn't there. That night, I made myself a promise. I wasn't going to chase after their validation anymore. If they couldn't see me by now, they never would. I decided I'd build a future with or without them, even if that meant carving it alone. Leaving home for college felt like air rushing into lungs I didn't realize had been starving. I packed up my sketch pads and my clothes, boarded a bus, and carried a quiet resolve that I was starting fresh. I enrolled at a university right in Georgia, majoring in graphic design, determined to prove, if only to myself, that my art mattered. And it was there, in one of those too bright lecture halls with chalk dust in the air, that I met Andrew. He was a teaching assistant for my intro class, thoughtful in a way that caught me off guard, and he noticed the small details in my work the way no one in my family ever had. It was the beginning of something I didn't yet understand, being seen, really seen, for the first time. Andrew had this kind of quiet confidence about him, the kind that didn't need to fill a room with noise to be felt. He'd lean over my sketches during studio hours, tapping his pencil against the page, asking questions no one had ever asked me before, like, "What story are you trying to tell with this line?" Or, "Do you notice how the colors fight each other here?" It wasn't criticism, it was belief. Belief that I could push harder, that what I was doing had weight. I found myself lingering after class, just to hear his take on the latest design trends, and somewhere between the late-night emails and the quiet encouragement, I realized he saw something in me that my own parents never had. Not long after, I stumbled into a friendship I didn't even know I was desperate for. Taylor Adams was a photography major, the kind of girl who carried her camera like an extra limb and had a laugh that could fill a room. She was quick-witted, brutally honest, and had this endless energy that both exhausted and saved me. One afternoon, she caught me sulking over a pile of rejected sketches in the cafeteria, plopped down across from me, and without even asking, started critiquing them. "This one's stiff, but this one has heart," she said, stabbing her finger at the page. From that day forward, she was in my corner, dragging me to gallery openings I was too shy to attend, making me see my work through lenses I didn't even know existed. With Andrew and Taylor in my orbit, I started to feel something I hadn't felt in years, like I belonged somewhere. My first year was brutal, the kind of year where you drink coffee until your hands shake and collapse on your dorm bed, just to wake up 2 hours later to finish a project. I pulled all-nighters perfecting logos and layouts, my desk littered with energy drink cans and eraser shavings. But it was exhilarating, too. Every project felt like a tiny rebellion against the version of me my parents had written off. It turned out, the professors noticed, one of them, a sharp-eyed woman named Dr. Ramirez, pulled me aside after class and told me she saw something in my compositions. A month later, she connected me to a local design studio in Atlanta, and suddenly I was sitting in meetings surrounded by professionals, my notebooks filled with real deadlines instead of hypothetical assignments. By junior year, I was juggling classes, late nights at the studio, and small freelance gigs, designing logos for coffee shops, flyers for local bands, branding for mom-and-pop stores. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. Every paycheck, every finished project, every moment someone said, "We love your work," stitched together a part of me I'd thought was permanently broken. Those years weren't glamorous by any stretch. I wasn't designing billboards in Times Square or fashion campaigns in New York. Most days it was logos for mom-and-pop cafes or flyers for local music festivals, the kind of work that barely paid the rent, but gave me something priceless: momentum. Every finished project felt like a small step out of the shadow I'd lived under for so long. And even though I knew better, a part of me still wanted my parents to notice. I'd send them emails with updates, attaching my latest designs, carefully typing out little explanations like a child bringing home finger paintings. I'd wait, refreshing my inbox, hoping for pride. But it never came. One afternoon, my mom finally called. My heart jumped, thinking maybe this was it. Maybe she'd ask about my internship or my sketches. Instead, her voice was clipped, businesslike, and the only thing she wanted to know was if I was keeping up socially. Was I networking like Sydney? Was I making the right friends? Because apparently Sydney was already thriving in law school, interning at a prestigious firm, earning nods from professors and partners alike. And my parents never missed a chance to remind me that she was setting the family up for success, as if my own efforts didn't even register on their scale. By senior year, though, I finally landed something that felt huge. A regional advertising agency gave me a contract to design a full campaign. I poured myself into it, months of sketching and revising, tweaking colors until my eyes blurred, triple-checking every font and line. When it finally launched, it got picked up in a local industry blog, and my name was right there in print. I was elated, shaking as I typed an email to my parents with the link, convinced this time they'd have to see me. This time they'd have no choice but to say they were proud. The reply came hours later from my dad. 4 words. "That's nice, but have you talked to Sydney? She's working on a big case." My heart sank so fast it felt physical, like falling down an elevator shaft. I showed the email to Taylor, and she didn't even try to hide her anger. She shook her head, muttering, "They don't deserve you, Claire." Not one bit later, when I showed Andrew the campaign, his reaction couldn't have been more different. He grinned, bought me coffee, and spent an entire hour asking me about my creative process. Not just what I did, but why I did it, what I felt while designing it. For the first time in my life, I realized that being celebrated wasn't about grand speeches or gold plaques. Sometimes it was about someone leaning in, really listening, and saying with their whole presence, "I see you." Andrew wasn't just supportive in the way people say nice things to make you feel better. He really understood what my work meant to me. He saw the way my eyes lit up when I solved a design problem, or how I got lost in choosing just the right shade of blue. His belief in me made me bolder, like I could finally risk stepping into the light I'd always been told wasn't mine. We started dating that year, and somewhere between coffee runs and late nights in the computer lab, I realized I had someone in my corner who didn't just love me, but respected the part of me that had always been invisible at home. With him behind me, I said yes to bigger projects, like rebranding a whole chain of local coffee shops. It was stressful. Endless revisions, last-minute client calls, nights when I thought my hands might cramp permanently around a mouse. But when I saw the finished logos gleaming on storefront windows, it felt like proof I was becoming who I was meant to be. By the time graduation rolled around, I had built a portfolio I was genuinely proud of. That body of work landed me a full-time job at a mid-sized agency in Atlanta, my first real step into the professional world. I was 22, armed with nothing but ambition, a diploma, and the hope that maybe, finally, my parents would notice. I sent them the news, voice shaking as I hit send, but all I got was silence. No call, no text, not even a polite congratulations. It stung, because I was still carrying this fragile hope that they'd see me differently now that I had a career. During those years, Taylor became my lifeline. We had this little ritual, meeting at a 24-hour diner near campus. the kind with cracked vinyl booths and coffee that tasted like burnt toast. We'd sit there until 2 in the morning, her ranting about how unfair my parents were, me picking at cold fries. She'd slam her mug on the table, making the spoons rattle, and say, "You're killing it, Claire." They're just too blind to see it. And I'd laugh, sometimes with tears stinging my eyes because she was right. She pushed me to double down on my own goals, to pour my energy into clients who appreciated my work instead of chasing scraps from people who never would. I started taking on more freelance gigs on top of my agency work, websites for scrappy little startups, posters for local festivals, branding packages for neighborhood businesses. Every project stretched me, sharpened me, gave me a confidence I hadn't known before. I began to care less about whether my parents would ever call me successful, but if I'm honest, the longing didn't vanish. Deep down, there was still this quiet ache, a wish to be seen by them just once the way they saw Sydney. By my mid-20s, though, I was thriving in spite of it. The agency promoted me to lead designer on a major account, a national retailer's full rebrand, a 6-figure contract, the kind of project most people my age could only dream of. I remember standing in the office late one night, staring at the glowing mock-ups on my screen, and for the first time I let myself whisper, "You did this, Claire. This is yours." I'll never forget that phone call. My hands were trembling as I dialed, the glow of my office computer still fresh in my eyes, my heart pounding like I was a teenager again, waiting for approval. I told my mom about the national rebrand I'd been leading, my voice spilling over with pride and nerves, hoping maybe this time I'd finally crack the wall between us. For a split second, there was silence on the other end, and I held my breath, waiting for that proud tone I'd always wanted. Instead, she sighed, distracted, and said, "That sounds like a lot of work. Have you checked in with Sydney?" She's been so busy. Just like that, my joy turned to ash in my mouth. I muttered a goodbye and hung up, staring at my phone in disbelief, my chest hollow. That was the last time I ever tried to share my success with them. I knew in that moment I could achieve the impossible, and it still wouldn't measure up to Sydney simply existing in their eyes. That call broke something inside me, but it also forced me to look at what I did have. I had Andrew. I had a man who celebrated me not because of a title or a paycheck, but because he saw the fire in my work. I started pouring everything into the life we were building together, letting go of the fantasy of my parents ever joining me on that path. One evening, Andrew and I were walking along the Chattahoochee River just outside Atlanta, the cicadas humming in the trees, the air warm and heavy with the smell of pine. He stopped mid-step, pulled a small ring from his pocket, nothing flashy, just simple and beautiful, and asked me to marry him. His eyes held a steadiness I'd been craving my whole life, and I didn't hesitate. I said yes, my chest swelling with a kind of hope I hadn't dared to feel in years. We decided on a small wedding at a riverside restaurant we both loved, a place with soft light and wooden beams, where the water shimmered outside the windows at dusk. I threw myself into every detail, not out of perfectionism, but out of love. I hand-drew the invitations myself, each line carefully inked, each flourish a piece of my heart on paper. For the first time in so long, I let myself imagine my parents there, my mom in the front row dabbing her eyes, my dad shaking Andrew's hand, Sydney smiling as a bridesmaid. I convinced myself that maybe this milestone would finally matter enough to break through their indifference. I poured months into planning with that hope tucked quietly in the back of my mind, like a secret prayer. Every time I sealed another envelope with their names on it, I imagined them opening it, feeling pride at last. Looking back, I realize how naive that hope was, but at the time it felt like the one thread I couldn't bear to cut. Because no matter how many times they dismissed me, there was still a part of me, the little girl clutching her art certificate in a too-big living room, that longed for them to finally see me. I remember the day I dropped those invitations in the mailbox like it was yesterday. I had pressed the envelopes flat with my palm, my handwriting neat and careful, their names written as though the act of addressing them with love could make them show up. Charles and Diane Patterson, my parents. Sydney Patterson, my sister. My heart was racing as if those invitations weren't just paper, but bridges I was begging them to walk across. I even called afterward, my voice shaking as I left a voicemail for my mom, whispering, "It'd mean everything if you could come." When my dad finally texted back, all he wrote was, "We'll try to make it." It wasn't a promise, but I clung to it anyway, holding it like a scrap of warmth in my pocket. Sydney never replied. She was knee-deep in planning her engagement to Jeffrey Hamilton, her shiny entrepreneur fiancé, and the silence from her side of the family tree said it all. Still, I kept refreshing my phone, hoping for a text, even just a thumbs-up emoji, some acknowledgement that I existed. Nothing came. Days before the wedding, I was still convincing myself that people change, that maybe this would be the moment they'd realize I mattered too. Then the call came. I saw my mom's name flash across the screen, and for a moment, relief washed over me. I braced myself for the questions I thought she'd finally ask. "What flowers are you using? Do you have enough seating? How can we help?" Instead, her voice was flat, practiced, as she said, "Claire, we're not coming." The words hung in the air like a slap. I swallowed hard, asked her why, my voice cracking in ways I couldn't control. Her reply still rings in my ears. "This is a trivial event for someone at the bottom, and we're busy with Sydney's engagement." My body went cold, as if all the air had been sucked out of the room. I asked again, desperate, needing her to hear the tremble in my voice, but she doubled down, explaining they were flying to Hawaii to celebrate with Sydney and Jeffrey. "It's a big moment for us," she added, dismissing my wedding like it was nothing more than a scheduling conflict. I sat there staring at the phone long after the call ended, my chest burning, my hands numb. That was the moment it finally hit me in a way I couldn't deny anymore. No matter how much I loved them, no matter how hard I tried, I was never going to be their priority. When I hung up the phone that day, my hands wouldn't stop trembling. I felt like my entire body was vibrating with shock. Andrew wrapped his arms around me and held me as I sobbed, whispering that no matter what my parents did or didn't do, we would make the day ours. And I clung to his words like a lifeline. When the morning of the wedding finally came, I slipped into the gown I had designed myself, each stitch and seam touched by my own hands, and tried to steady my breath. Walking down that aisle, my eyes locked on Andrew's steady gaze, the world felt both unbearably heavy and impossibly light at the same time. Taylor was there, loud and unapologetic, snapping photos and cheering for me like she had been waiting for this moment her whole life. Andrew's parents, Frank and Eleanor Parker, greeted me with such warmth I nearly broke down in their arms, Eleanor smoothing the veil from my shoulders, Frank squeezing my hand like I was already family. Their kindness softened the jagged edges of the hole my own parents had left, but even as I stood at the altar, surrounded by laughter and love, my eyes kept drifting toward those empty chairs. The sight of them felt like a wound that wouldn't close, glaring reminders of who had chosen not to be there. I tried to push it aside, tried to let Andrew's vows carry me, to let the glow of candles and the sound of clinking glasses fill the space where my family's voices should have been. And for a while, it worked. The reception was warm and joyful, filled with friends, with Andrew's family dancing and toasting, with Taylor pulling me onto the floor until I was laughing breathlessly. For those hours, I felt cherished. I felt like I belonged. But even then, in the middle of all that love, there was still a small ache deep inside me, the stubborn hope that maybe my parents would change their minds, that maybe a text would appear, a call, some acknowledgement that I was their daughter too. That night, after the last dance and the goodbyes, when the music had faded and Andrew was carrying our gifts up to the room, I sat on the edge of the bed still in my dress, phone in hand, praying for that message. The screen lit up with a notification, and my heart leapt. For one breathless moment, I thought maybe it was them reaching out. But as soon as I clicked, the truth hit me like ice in my veins. It wasn't a call or a text. It was a social media post from my mother. The video started automatically, bright and loud, filling the dark silence of our hotel room. There they were, my parents, Charles and Diane, with Sydney and Jeffrey, standing on a sunlit beach in Hawaii, tropical drinks in their hands, palm trees swaying behind them like a postcard. Sydney's engagement ring caught the light as she leaned into Jeffrey, both of them beaming while my parents grinned, as if they hadn't just abandoned their own daughter's wedding. The caption stung worse than the video itself, "Celebrating our star's engagement in paradise." Not a single word about me, about the vows I'd taken just hours before. Each frame branded itself into me, proof they hadn't just skipped my wedding. They had broadcast their choice to the world, proud of it. I must have watched that clip a dozen times, each replay cutting deeper until I couldn't tell if I was furious or hollow. Tears blurred the screen, and that's when Taylor found me. She pulled the phone from my hand, her voice fierce, as she wrapped me in her arms. "They don't get to hurt you like this, Claire." Andrew came in moments later, his jaw tight, eyes burning as he saw the video. He didn't need to say much. He just sat beside me, pressed his hand to mine, and whispered, "You're worth more than this." Even Frank and Eleanor, Andrew's parents, offered to reach out to mine, their faces full of protective kindness. But I shook my head. I didn't want apologies forced out of guilt. I wanted them to care on their own, and deep down, I knew they never would. The next morning, I found myself replaying the video again as though I could decode the reason behind their choice. But there was no hidden message, no secret logic, just a celebration of Sydney and Jeffrey, while my wedding was treated as disposable. Sydney hadn't even sent a single text, not a quick "congratulations" or "sorry we can't be there." My parents hadn't called to check in. Their absence wasn't an oversight. It was deliberate, and that video was their proud announcement to the world. To them, I was nothing. My milestones barely a footnote to the grand story they were writing about Sydney. And yet, when I looked over at Andrew, his steady hand still holding mine as if it belonged there forever, something shifted. The ache was still raw, but I realized their rejection didn't have to define me. I had a family now, one I had chosen and who had chosen me back. That realization was fragile, like glass, but it was enough to keep me standing. A week later, Andrew and I returned to our small apartment in Atlanta, boxes half unpacked, wedding gifts stacked by the door, trying to settle into the rhythm of married life. I was just beginning to breathe again when my phone rang. It was my dad. His voice was clipped, businesslike, as if the wedding had been a minor event checked off a calendar. My stomach sank. I knew this wasn't going to be a call about love. The call started so casually that I almost didn't register what my father was saying. His voice was clipped, detached, as if he were running through a to-do list. "Claire, we need to talk about the loan." For a second, I thought I'd misheard him. A loan? My stomach dropped, confusion knotting in my chest. He explained, matter of fact, that he and my mom expected me to contribute toward a debt they claimed they'd taken out years ago to cover my college tuition. Only now, he said, it was time to repay it so they could use the money for something important, Sydney's upcoming wedding. "It's only fair," he added, his tone sharp with entitlement. "This is a big moment for the family." I sat there stunned, the phone slick in my hand. My parents had dismissed my wedding as trivial, skipped it for a Hawaiian vacation, and now they were asking me to help bankroll Sydney's celebration, the same sister who hadn't even sent me a text on my big day. I forced myself to breathe, to keep my voice even, and finally asked, "What loan?" Without hesitation, he rattled off a number, $20,000. He insisted they had covered it for me, like it was an established fact I should accept without question. His tone implied I owed them, as though my own wedding had been meaningless, but Sydney's deserved to drain my bank account. My heart hammered so loud I could barely hear myself say I'd look into it before hanging up. When I set the phone down, my hands were shaking. Andrew was watching me from across the room, his brow furrowed. "What happened?" he asked, his voice careful. I told him, the words tumbling out in a rush, and his face tightened with anger. "They can't keep doing this to you," he said, his hand gripping mine like an anchor, and yet the weight of my father's words pressed hard on my chest, filling me with a sick dread that maybe, somehow, I'd overlooked something. That night, I dragged out an old box of records I hadn't touched in years. The cardboard smelled faintly of dust and ink, the papers inside creased from being moved too many times. I sat cross-legged on the floor, folder after folder spread around me, flipping through bank statements, loan agreements, every scrap of proof I'd saved. My fingers trembled as I traced the faded ink, but the story was clear. Every single payment had been made, on time, directly from my account. I remembered the long nights I'd worked freelance projects, the extra shifts I'd taken at the agency, the exhaustion I wore like a second skin just to keep those payments steady. I had carried that burden myself. They hadn't lifted a finger. And now, to hear my father rewriting the past to guilt me into financing Sydney's wedding, it was like he was trying to erase the years of sweat and sacrifice that had shaped me. The more I dug, the clearer it became. There was no loan, no hidden balance, no secret debt quietly waiting for me. I went over every file until my eyes blurred, then I called the bank to be absolutely certain. The representative confirmed what I already knew in my gut. My college loans had been cleared years ago, every payment made directly by me. My father's story wasn't just wrong, it was a lie, a carefully crafted ploy to guilt me into funding Sydney's lavish wedding. The realization settled over me like ice. This wasn't about money, it was about control, about keeping me in my place while Sydney remained their chosen star. The next day, I called him back. I remember how steady my hands felt on the phone, even as my stomach churned. My voice came out sharper than I expected, almost calm in its precision. I checked the records, I said. My loans were paid in full, on time, by me. There's no debt on the other end, my father sputtered, fumbling for words, insisting I must have misunderstood, that surely I was forgetting something. Then he pivoted, his voice growing more insistent. Cheryl's wedding is important. You should want to help your sister. In the background, I could hear my mother murmuring her agreement, like a chorus reinforcing the script I'd known my whole life. Claire comes second, Sydney comes first. That's when it finally hit me with full force. They were never going to see me as their equal. They had dismissed my wedding as a trivial event, skipped it without a shred of regret, and now they expected me to bankroll Sydney's as though my life was nothing more than a footnote in hers. The memories crashed over me. The empty chairs at my ceremony, the video of them in Hawaii, my mother's voice dismissing my vows as something for someone at the bottom. I felt the heat rise in my chest, but instead of breaking, I found a cold clarity. Don't contact me about trivial matters, I said, throwing her own words back like a stone into still water. The silence on the line was sharp enough to cut. For once, I wasn't begging for their approval. I wasn't stumbling to explain myself. I wasn't swallowing my pain. My voice was steady, and I knew they heard it. In that moment, I felt something I'd never felt in all my years of chasing them: power. There was this heavy silence after I threw my mother's words back at them, the kind of silence where you can practically hear someone's pride crack. My father tried to rally, his voice rising as he started to argue, but I cut him off before he could gather steam. I'm done, I said, steady and final, then hung up. For a few seconds I just sat there, phone pressed to my palm, my pulse thundering in my ears. And then, slowly, I felt it. The weight I'd carried for nearly 3 decades, that constant ache of trying to prove myself, began to lift. My hands were shaking, my heart racing, but underneath it all was a strange, unfamiliar lightness. For the first time, I wasn't begging. I wasn't trying to earn their love. I was taking back my power. When I told Andrew what had happened, his response was immediate. He didn't try to play devil's advocate, didn't suggest I misunderstood. He pulled me into his arms and said, "You did the right thing." His voice was steady, like he'd been waiting years for me to realize this truth about myself. That night, I called Taylor because I needed to hear her fire, needed her bluntness. As soon as I explained, she exploded, her words sharp and protective. "They're unbelievable, Claire. They don't deserve a single ounce of you. And you sure as hell don't owe them a dime." I could almost see her pacing in her apartment, her camera bag slung over a chair, anger flashing in her eyes. She had always been my fiercest defender, but in that moment, I felt like she was carrying the outrage I hadn't fully allowed myself to feel. Later that evening, Frank and Eleanor Parker, Andrew's parents, came over. I hadn't planned on telling them, but the words spilled out anyway. I sat at our small kitchen table, explaining what my parents had said, my voice still trembling with a mix of anger and disbelief. Eleanor reached across the table and took my hand in hers, her touch warm and grounding. "You're family to us, Claire," she said gently. "You don't need their validation." Frank nodded, his expression solemn but kind, adding, "Some people don't see what they have until it's gone. Don't let them dim your light." Their kindness was almost too much to bear. Tears blurred my vision as I looked at these people who hadn't raised me, hadn't been there for all the small milestones of my childhood, and yet somehow they were treating me with more love than my own parents ever had. In that moment, I realized something quietly profound. Family isn't just blood. Sometimes it's the people who show up when you're breaking, who remind you of your worth when you can't find it yourself. That night, for the first time in a long time, I felt safe. Even with Andrew's arms around me, Taylor's fire in my ear, and Frank and Eleanor's warmth steadying me, that phone call clung to me like smoke. It wasn't just about the money. It was never just about that. My father hadn't simply asked for help. He had tried to rewrite my history, twisting years of sacrifice into some debt I supposedly owed. It was a way to pull me back under, to keep me in the shadows while Sydney basked in their spotlight. And the more I thought about it, the clearer it became. It wasn't an oversight, it was intentional. They needed me small so she could stay big. For a brief moment, I thought about calling Sydney just to hear her side. Maybe she'd say she didn't know, maybe she'd apologize for staying silent. But then I remembered the empty chair at my wedding, her silence when my vows echoed through that room. Not even a text, not even a "sorry I can't make it." The truth was, she didn't need to speak. Her absence said everything. She was complicit, perfectly happy to let our parents prioritize her, as long as it kept the spotlight fixed where she liked it. That night, Andrew and I sat at our kitchen table, the soft hum of the refrigerator filling the silence. We flipped through our wedding photos on Taylor's camera. Image after image glowed on the screen. My smile, raw and unguarded, Andrew's voice caught mid-vow, Taylor laughing with her head thrown back, Frank and Eleanor dancing like the world belonged to them. It was joy captured in pixels, a joy that had nothing to do with my parents. Looking at those photos, I felt a strange mix of grief and relief. Grief for the family I'd always wanted but would never have, and relief for the chosen family I had built instead. I realized then that Charles, Diane, and Sydney didn't get to define me. They never had, though I'd spent years giving them that power. I had already built a career from nothing, fought for every inch of recognition without their help. I had a marriage grounded in love and respect. I had friends who showed up for me, family who claimed me as their own, and a future I was shaping with my own two hands. For the first time, I understood that my worth had never belonged to them. It was mine all along. Their attempt to drag me back into their chaos had the opposite effect. It only clarified what I needed to do. Standing firm against my father's lie about that so-called loan was a turning point. I was drained, hollowed out from years of begging to be seen, and I knew I couldn't keep walking around with that weight pressing on my chest. Cutting them off wasn't an impulsive act of anger, it was an act of survival. For the first time, I allowed myself to say the words out loud. I needed to protect my own peace, even if it meant closing the door on my parents and my sister for good. I reached out to Dr. Pamela Hughes, a therapist Taylor had been seeing to manage her own stress. I'll never forget walking into that quiet office in Midtown Atlanta, the faint smell of chamomile tea hanging in the air, the walls lined with soft colors instead of the stiff family portraits I'd grown up with. I poured out everything, years of being overshadowed, the humiliation of my wedding, the bitterness of that phone call about money. Dr. Hughes listened intently, her eyes calm but piercing, nodding as if she could feel the weight I'd been carrying. And then she said something so simple it cracked me open. "You've been living under their expectations for far too long. Boundaries aren't selfish, Claire. They're a way of reclaiming your life." Her words stayed with me as I went home that night and sat at our kitchen table with Andrew. He placed his hand over mine, steady and warm, as if to anchor me in the storm. "You don't owe them anything," he told me softly, his gaze unwavering. "Write what you need to say." Taylor came by later, full of her usual fire, pacing our living room like a caged lion. "They've had enough chances," she snapped. "This is about you now, Claire." Not them. Between Andrew's calm and Taylor's fierce loyalty, I felt stronger than I had in years. Still, when I finally opened my laptop to draft the email, my fingers hovered over the keys, trembling. How do you condense a lifetime of neglect, disappointment, and betrayal into a few paragraphs? I wanted every word to be precise, to reflect not just my anger, but my finality. This wasn't a plea or a negotiation. This was closure. I wrote, deleted, rewrote, until the words began to take shape. Words that no longer asked for love or understanding, only declared my boundary with clarity. For the first time, I wasn't writing for their approval. I was writing for me. I sat at my desk late into the night, the glow of the laptop painting my face in pale light, the cursor blinking like it was daring me to finally speak my truth. I addressed the email to Charles, Diane, and Sydney, and let the words spill out. "Your actions have shown me where I stand in your lives. From the years of favoritism, to dismissing my wedding, to demanding money for Sydney's, you've made your priorities clear. I'm done carrying the weight of your expectations. Do not contact me again, short, firm, unapologetic." For once, my words weren't bent into a shape to please them. They were sharp, deliberate, mine. I showed it to Dr. Hughes the next day, her calm eyes scanning each line. She nodded slowly, then suggested one more sentence. "Any future attempts to reach me will be ignored." It felt blunt, almost brutal, but it also gave me a sense of control I had never known with them. So I added it, my hand steady as I typed. When I read it back, it didn't sound like the scared daughter begging for scraps of affection. It sounded like a woman drawing her line in the sand. The act of sending it was terrifying. My finger hovered over the trackpad, my pulse pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Andrew sat beside me, his hand warm on my back. "You're doing this for you," he whispered. And with that, I hit send. The whoosh of the email leaving my outbox felt like the sound of a door slamming shut behind me. Relief washed over me, sharp and strange. I blocked their numbers, unfollowed them on social media, sealed the boundary in every way I could. Taylor came over that night, and the second I told her, she threw her arms around me, nearly knocking the air out of my lungs. "You're free now," she whispered fiercely into my ear. A few days later, in my next session, Dr. Hughes leaned forward and said, "You've chosen yourself, Claire." That's powerful. Her words sank deep, but the days that followed were strange. My body kept bracing for impact, waiting for a call, a text, some attempt to reel me back into the chaos. But the silence stretched on. For the first time in my life, their absence was louder than their voices, and somehow that silence began to feel like peace. Sydney stayed as silent as she had been on my wedding day, and my parents never sent so much as a one-line reply. Their silence was louder than words, confirmation of what I had always known but never wanted to admit. I had never really mattered to them. It stung, of course it did. A daughter is supposed to crave her mother's pride, her father's approval. But in that void, something unexpected stirred. Their absence, as painful as it was, freed me. For the first time in my life, I wasn't running laps in the endless race for their affection. I could finally step off the track. I leaned on Andrew, who never let a day pass without reminding me I was enough exactly as I was. Taylor kept me tethered to joy, dragging me to every gallery opening and street art show in Atlanta she could find, insisting I keep my creativity alive. And Frank and Eleanor Parker, Andrew's parents, stepped into a role I hadn't dared to hope for. They invited us over for Sunday dinners, filling the table with casseroles and laughter, treating me as if I had always been part of their family. One night, Eleanor shared stories of her own estrangement from a sibling, her eyes soft but steady. "Sometimes you have to let go to move forward," she told me, and in that moment I felt a void I had carried for years finally begin to fill with something warm. Dr. Hughes helped me face the guilt that crept in during quiet moments, the little voice that whispered maybe I had gone too far. She reminded me that boundaries weren't cruelty, they were survival, and I repeated those words to myself like a mantra. I threw myself into my design work with a new kind of fire, each project not just a job, but a declaration. Every logo I shaped, every campaign I led felt like proof that I was still standing, stronger than before. I wasn't diminished by their absence. I was illuminated by my resilience. Taylor noticed the difference before I did. She looked at me one night after an exhibit, wine glass in hand, and laughed. "You're glowing, Claire. They can't dim that, not anymore." She was right. Andrew and I started talking seriously about our future. A house, maybe children. A life built entirely on love instead of obligation. I felt lighter than I ever had, as if I had finally dropped a weight I'd been carrying since childhood. Cutting contact hadn't just been about walking away. It had been about rebuilding. Dr. Hughes reminded me often that while I had been shaped by their neglect, I wasn't defined by it. For the first time, I believed her. At Dr. Hughes's suggestion, I started keeping a journal, and for the first time in years, I gave myself permission to pour everything onto the page. Anger, grief, resentment, all the words I'd swallowed for so long finally had somewhere to land. But alongside them came sparks of something I hadn't expected. Hope. Entry by entry, I began to see that I was no longer trapped in their narrative. I was building a life with Andrew, with Taylor, with Frank and Eleanor, with people who saw me, who valued me, and that was enough. Of course, cutting ties with my parents in Sydney didn't just free me, it sent ripples through their carefully constructed world. Charles and Diane had always relied on appearances, but appearances are fragile things. Word of what they had done, skipping my wedding for Hawaii, demanding money to fund Sydney's, spread quietly but quickly through our extended family. My cousin Mary Sanders was the first to reach out. She'd always been close to me, but when we sat down over coffee one afternoon and I told her everything, she was furious. "They've always put Sydney first," she said, shaking her head. "But this is shameful." From that day on, she stopped inviting them to gatherings, and others began to follow her lead. Aunts and uncles, who had once stayed neutral, began declining their calls. Holidays grew smaller for them, the phone ringing less, doors quietly closing. In our tight-knit Atlanta community, neighbors whispered. People noticed the empty spaces at church, the way their social circle shrank. Charles and Diane had spent years curating a picture of success, but cracks were showing now, and the shine was wearing off. They had traded authenticity for image, and the image was crumbling. And Sydney? For a while she floated untouched, still basking in my parents' glow, still presented as the star. But her engagement to Jeffrey Hamilton, which my parents had paraded like a crown jewel, began to falter. Jeffrey's family valued fairness, and when they heard about the favoritism, the skipped wedding, the so-called loan, they didn't laugh it off. They asked questions, they frowned, they pulled back. I wasn't there for their arguments, but word drifted back through cousins and friends. Jeffrey didn't like what he was seeing. Sydney, for once, wasn't the golden child in every room. Mary was the one who told me about that dinner. She said Jeffrey's parents had invited Sydney and my mom and dad over, and somewhere between the salad and dessert, the subject of my wedding came up. Jeffrey's mother didn't mince words. "It's not right," she said sharply, staring straight at Sydney, "that your family skipped your sister's wedding to fly off to Hawaii for yours." Mary told me. Sydney flushed, scrambling to defend our parents, repeating the same old lines about priorities and timing. But later, Jeffrey himself admitted to Mary that it had caused real tension. He had started to see the dynamic differently, not just my parents' favoritism, but Sydney's silence, her complicity, her willingness to let it all happen while she soaked up their adoration. What had once seemed like a solid relationship began to crack under the weight of those questions. Mary became my messenger of sorts, calling me with updates or dropping by with her kids, her eyes bright with indignation. One afternoon, she leaned across my kitchen counter and said, "Joseph and Diane are starting to feel it. They thought they could get away with it." There was a satisfaction in her tone, and though I didn't gloat, I couldn't deny the quiet justice that settled in my chest. Their downfall wasn't something I orchestrated. It was the natural consequence of their choices, of years of cruelty finally catching up with them. And for once, I wasn't the one carrying the burden. Dr. Hughes helped me sit with that strange mix of relief and sadness. "You set a boundary," she reminded me, "and the world is responding. That's not your burden, Claire. That's theirs." It was freeing to hear those words, to know I wasn't responsible for how their lives unraveled after I walked away. For so long, I had felt guilty for not trying harder, for not bending further to earn their love. Now I saw that my absence wasn't what damaged them, their own actions had. Meanwhile, my own life was blooming. Andrew and I had built a home that felt alive with love and laughter, not performance or pretense. One evening, curled up on the couch with takeout containers scattered on the coffee table, Andrew took my hand in his and said quietly, "I think we're ready for the next step." We'd been circling the idea for months, timidly at first, then more openly, until the words felt natural on our tongues. And soon after, the test confirmed what my heart had already hoped. I was pregnant. Joy flooded through me, the kind of joy I had never believed possible after all the years of emptiness. I told Taylor first, and she practically shrieked with excitement, already pulling out a notebook to plan the baby shower. For the first time, the future stretched before me not as a question mark, but as a promise. When I told Taylor I was pregnant, she nearly knocked me over with one of her bone-crushing hugs. "You're going to be the best mom," she whispered fiercely, as if she was making a vow on my behalf. Frank and Eleanor were overjoyed too, already knitting tiny blankets and competing over who would get the first turn babysitting. Their excitement filled the spaces my parents had left empty, and for once, I didn't feel the ache of their absence. I felt the fullness of the family I had chosen. My pregnancy gave me a new focus, a steadiness I hadn't known before. I spent hours sketching patterns for the nursery walls, dreaming up colors that would make our baby's first world feel bright and safe. Work was thriving at the same time. I landed a major contract with a local company in Atlanta, and my designs started earning praise in industry blogs. Each success felt like another step away from the shadow of my parents' rejection, proof that I wasn't defined by their silence. Andrew and I took long evening walks along the Chattahoochee River, his hand resting gently on my growing belly, his voice soft but certain. "They'll grow up knowing they're loved." That promise grounded me more than anything else ever had. Mary visited often, slipping into the role of sister in ways Sydney never had. She'd arrive with bags of baby clothes, her eyes shining as she shared stories about our extended family's shifting loyalties. One afternoon, she shook her head and told me how my father had tried to explain himself at a reunion. "But no one bought it, Claire," she said with quiet satisfaction. "I didn't ask for the details. I didn't need them. Their unraveling was no longer my concern. My focus was on the life I was building, not the one I'd left behind." Taylor and Dr. Hughes kept me steady through those months, reminding me to celebrate the strength it had taken to get here. "You've created something beautiful, Doctor," Hughes told me one afternoon in her office, and for the first time I let the words sink in. As my due date drew closer, a deep peace settled over me. Andrew and I signed up for parenting classes and laughed until we cried at our clumsy attempts to swaddle a doll. Frank and Eleanor hosted a small gathering in their backyard, the air filled with barbecue smoke and laughter, their warmth wrapping around me like the family I'd always longed for. It was such a stark contrast to the coldness I'd grown up with that sometimes it made my chest ache, not from grief, but from gratitude. In the end, I realized I had stumbled into something far more valuable than the approval I once chased. A chosen family who saw me, who valued me, who showed up without conditions. Charles, Diane, and Sydney began to fade into the background of my life, their names carrying less weight with each passing season. Their world narrowed under the weight of their own choices, while mine expanded in ways I had never dared to imagine. I didn't wish them harm, but I also didn't miss them. That absence, once so painful, became a kind of quiet gift. The peace I found after closing that chapter became the foundation for everything new. When I held our newborn daughter for the first time, her tiny fingers curling instinctively around mine, I felt a love so pure it rewrote everything I thought I knew about family. Andrew and I named her Emma, a name we'd chosen for its simplicity, its warmth, the way it felt like sunlight when you said it out loud. Staring into her dark, searching eyes, I understood that my story hadn't been just about surviving rejection. It had been about discovering who I was, what I valued, and how I wanted to build a future that looked nothing like the past. For years, I believed family was an obligation, a tie you never broke, no matter how much it bled you dry. But the truth is, my parents' favoritism, their dismissal of every milestone that mattered to me, their audacity to demand money I didn't owe, those things taught me otherwise. Family isn't defined by bloodlines or shared last names. It's defined by love, by respect, by the way people show up when it matters most. When my parents chose Sydney's engagement over my wedding, when they stood on a beach in Hawaii while I walked down the aisle to empty chairs, they showed me their true priorities. And I finally stopped pretending those priorities included me. Cutting them off wasn't easy. It felt like tearing out a root that had grown deep, even if it had been poisoning me. But it was necessary. Setting boundaries was the first time I truly chose myself. And with Dr. Hugh's guidance, I learned that self-acceptance isn't selfish, it's survival. My chosen family became the anchor I had longed for. Andrew, with his steady devotion, stood by me through every tear and every triumph. Taylor cheered me on with her fire and honesty. Frank and Eleanor wrapped me into their lives as if I had always been theirs. And holding Emma in my arms, I saw the cycle break. I knew with certainty that she would grow up never questioning her worth, never begging for love that should have been given freely. When I look back now, I see the threads that held me together weren't the ones I was born into, but the ones woven by the people who showed up when I needed them most. Taylor, my best friend, who dragged me out of my own shadows and into galleries and laughter, reminding me my art was worth fighting for. Frank and Eleanor, Andrew's parents, who wrapped me in unconditional acceptance and proved that family can be built, not just born. Mary, my cousin, who stepped into the role of sister in ways Sydney never could, her loyalty a balm I hadn't known I needed. Even Dr. Hughes, with her steady presence, who helped me untangle years of shame and find my own worth again. These people taught me that family isn't about titles or traditions. It's about who sees you, who stays, who chooses you back. The first time I held Emma, her tiny body resting against my chest, I knew without question that the cycle had ended with me. Andrew and I made a promise right then to raise her with kindness, to celebrate her not for who we wanted her to be, but for who she truly is. That vow became the cornerstone of our life together. And as my career grew, as more design projects came in, and my name began to carry weight in rooms my parents never bothered to imagine me in, I realized that every success wasn't just a line on a resume. It was proof that I had survived, rebuilt, and thrived, not because of them, but in spite of them. I don't need Charles, Diane, or Sydney to validate me anymore. Their absence is a scar, yes, but scars don't define the whole story. They're just reminders of what I've walked through. And my story now is one of purpose, of joy, of love freely given and freely received. I've built a life that feels whole, not perfect, not easy, but real. And I'm surrounded by people who chose me, day after day. And now I want to ask you, because I know I'm not alone in this. We all carry stories of family, of hurt, of healing. Maybe you've had to walk away from someone you thought you could never let go of. Maybe you've discovered a chosen family who lifted you higher than you thought possible. Whatever your story is, I want to hear it. Share it if you're willing, because telling these truths, no matter how hard, has a way of setting us free. Share your story in the comments. I want to know how you overcame family wounds, what you learned about yourself along the way, and what helped you heal. Your words might be exactly what someone else needs to take their first step toward peace. I read every comment, and I'm here to listen, just as you've listened to me. This journey taught me that letting go isn't weakness, it's strength. Self-acceptance means knowing your worth even when others refuse to see it. Boundaries aren't cold walls. They're doors that lead to healthier, truer connections. Family isn't always the one you're born into. Sometimes it's the one you build. Andrew, Emma, Taylor, Mary, Frank, and Eleanor, they're my family, built on love, respect, and presence. That's the legacy I want for my daughter, and it's the lesson I hope you carry from my story. Looking back now, I can say with certainty, I'm grateful for the pain, because it led me here. I'm not the girl who begged for scraps of approval anymore. I am a wife, a mother, an artist, a woman who knows her value. And if you're in the middle of your own storm, hear me when I say this. You don't have to stay in a place that hurts you. You can choose yourself, you can find your people, and you can build a life that feels like home. So share your story below. Let's lift each other up, because that's what real family does. This is my story, and I'm stronger for it.